One of my top 10, no, probably more like top 5 all-time favorite books is a book called Ender's Game. Here, see? And it's written by Orson Scott Card about 1977, I think. This is the book that whenever anybody asks me for a book recommendation, I tell them you have to read Ender's Game, because it doesn't matter whether or not they like sci-fi or not. I always end up hearing back from them saying that they loved the book. Okay, so if you have not read this book before, you need to stop watching this video right now, go to your local library, or you can order it off Amazon. I put a link to it down below as well, and read it. It's incredible. And besides, if you watch this video before you've read the book, it'll utterly ruin it, and I'll feel awful, and I don't want to do that, because part of what's so amazing about this book is how, and if I even tell you that, it might ruin it. So just go read it, and I'll be waiting here when you get back. Okay, so now that everybody here has read the book, I want to talk about the part where Ender is kind of depressed and frustrated and tired, and he's kind of quit battle school, and so they sent him down to Earth, and he's on a lake on a raft that he built with his sister Valentine, and he makes this confession to her that's somewhat startling. And it came down to this, Ender said. In the moment when I truly understand my enemy, understand him well enough to defeat him, then in that very moment I also love him. I think it's impossible to really understand somebody, what they want, what they believe, and not love them the way that they love themselves. And then in that very moment, when I love them, you beat them. For at that moment, Valentine was not afraid of his understanding. No, you don't understand. I destroy them. I make it impossible for them to ever hurt me again. I grind them and I grind them until they don't exist. Every time I read that without fail, I am bowled over. My breath is stolen, my chest is squeezed tight, and it's as if I'm slapped in the face with this sense of a deeper, harder, counterintuitive truth. There are actually two things here. One is this notion that if we truly try to understand our enemy, their strengths, their weaknesses, their hurts, their deepest fears, and their beliefs, then with that understanding will come empathy. We will no longer hate them, but love them. If you think about it, our natural human response to people that we hate is to dehumanize them, to call them names instead of their real given name, and to only list those things that make them less than what we think it is to be human. We do this with people of other religions all the time. I mean, think about it. Christians are taught to rename Muslims as terrorists. We do this with people of other political persuasions. Our TV news networks display exactly what I'm talking about perfectly well. But we don't just do this with general groups of people, we do this with individuals as well. We do this with that man or woman who hurt us deeply, think ex-husband, ex-girlfriend. We do this with that coworker or that family member that we just can't stand to be around. We do this with that community member whom we know have different belief systems than we do. So one of the many times that I've done this is one time I had to work with this guy, and I hated him, and I thought that everything he was doing was wrong and was hurting the system and hurting people. And whenever I would talk about him with friends or family, I would only refer to him as that arrogant bastard. And really, by refusing to call him by his real name and instead give him a name that makes him sound like an awful, evil person, I was really just justifying my own desire to treat him badly. But the thing is when you start to understand someone, really understand them, to see why they do the things they do, in all of their humanness, then you can't help but start to have compassion. You can't hate them anymore. It's like when you hear the story of a man who molested a couple children. And our first inclination is to say that man is evil. He is less than human. But then you find out that that man himself was molested as a child. And somehow, subconsciously, he learned that the only way to be loved and to show love is to molest. And suddenly, you can't call him less than human anymore. Suddenly, you can't call him evil. He is human. He is flawed, and what he did was completely wrong. But now you have compassion for him, and you can't help but take pity on him and love him to some degree, even in his wretchedness. That's an extreme example, I know, but think about that ex, that coworker, that family member, that person whom you just can't stand. If you're willing to try to understand that person's story, that person's deepest fears and their strengths and their weaknesses and the things that motivate them to do the things that they do, you might just stop hating them. In fact, you might be able to start having compassion for them as you see them in their humanness. So there's this quote from a Zen Buddhist monk that I really like. His name was Thich Nhat Hahn. And he says to love our enemy is impossible because the moment we understand our enemy, we feel compassion towards him or her, and he or she is no longer our enemy. I mean, it's a lot like how the Christian scriptures say to love your enemy. And maybe the way to do that is to try to understand them. The second thing is what we choose to do once we have reached that point. Do we choose forgiveness because now it's possible? Or do we choose to use the knowledge we have to hurt them far worse than we could have before? Ender hates himself because he always chooses the latter. In Ender's experience, he believes at the core of his being that when he is threatened, he must end things immediately and decisively, or else he will suffer continual pain and abuse that will never end. And yet the buggers, those whom he annihilates, end up coming to understand that about him. They understand that belief, that fear that motivates him to end up annihilating their own race. And the amazing thing is they have compassion for him. They end up loving him, and they choose to forgive him, and all of the human race for that matter. And even more profoundly is that in coming to understand Ender, they come to understand themselves and their own faults and mistakes and participation in the end of their own race. And that's what I want to learn to do. I want to learn how to honestly be open to understanding and possibly coming to love my enemies, those people whom I dislike and whom I judge. I want to learn how to forgive. And I don't mean just the little things either. I want to learn how to forgive in such a way that when my heart is rent in two, or when I see someone I love hurt beyond repair, that in the midst of all of that rage and pain and frustration, that I can come to a place where I can understand why that person did what they did, and perhaps come to a place, once the dust has settled, in forgiving them. I want to learn to be humble enough to understand that yes, that person's not perfect, but neither am I, and therefore I might be at fault as well. I do want to learn to be like Ender, but I want even more to learn to be like the buggers. Like and subscribe either at tingledfaith.com or at Tingled Faith on YouTube, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.